In October 1973, the modern world discovered a frightening truth. Industrial civilization ran on a single lifeline: oil. Factories, cars, shipping, electricity generation, agriculture, plastics, aviation, nearly every pillar of the global economy depended on a steady flow of petroleum. For decades after the Second World War, that flow had seemed endless and cheap. Western economies grew rapidly under the assumption that oil would always be abundant. Then, almost overnight, the system began to crack. The immediate trigger came during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. When Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, the conflict quickly pulled the United States and the Soviet Union into a tense geopolitical confrontation. Washington supplied military support to Israel. In response, several Arab oil-producing nations decided to weaponize the most powerful economic resource they possessed. Under the leadership of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, particularly its Arab members, oil exports to the United States and several European allies were cut dramatically. The policy became known as the 1973 Oil Embargo. Within weeks, the consequences rippled across the industrial world. Oil prices quadrupled. Gasoline stations across the United States closed for days at a time. Long lines of cars stretched across city blocks as drivers waited hours for fuel deliveries. Governments introduced emergency policies, rationing, reduced speed limits, and no driving days intended to conserve fuel. What had once been an invisible foundation of modern life suddenly became the most fragile element in the global system. For Western leaders, the crisis exposed a dangerous strategic vulnerability. By the early 1970s, the United States, the world's largest economy, had become increasingly dependent on imported oil. Much of that supply originated from politically unstable regions in the Middle East. European countries faced an even greater dependency. A handful of exporting nations now possess the ability to disrupt the entire global economy. The crisis was not merely about energy prices, it was about geopolitical power. For decades, Western governments had assumed control over global energy markets. Oil companies based in the United States and Europe dominated exploration, production, and pricing. But the 1970s shifted that balance dramatically. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq now possessed enormous leverage over the industrial world. The sudden transfer of power shocked policymakers, but the embargo was only the first shock. A second wave of disruption arrived at the end of the decade. In 1979, revolution swept through Iran. The overthrow of the monarchy of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and the establishment of the Islamic Republic under Ruhollah Khomeini triggered a collapse in Iranian oil production. The result was the 1979 oil crisis. Once again, global oil markets panicked. Prices surged. Inflation spread across industrial economies. Governments confronted the terrifying possibility that energy scarcity could trigger prolonged economic stagnation. The crises of the 1970s forced political leaders to reconsider a fundamental question: what would happen if the world could no longer rely on oil? For the first time since the beginning of the industrial age, governments began searching urgently for alternatives. One of the earliest responses came from nuclear power. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, nuclear energy had been promoted as a futuristic technology capable of generating vast amounts of electricity. But adoption had been slow. Oil and coal were cheaper and easier to deploy. The oil shocks changed that calculation. Countries that lacked domestic fossil fuel reserves suddenly saw nuclear power as a strategic necessity. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in France. After the 1973 crisis, French policymakers launched an ambitious national program known as the Mesmer Plan, named after Prime Minister Pierre Mesmer. The goal was simple: eliminate dependence on imported oil by building a massive fleet of nuclear reactors. Within 2 decades, France constructed one of the largest nuclear energy systems in the world. By the 1990s, nuclear plants supplied the majority of the country's electricity. Other nations pursued similar strategies. Japan, lacking significant domestic energy resources, expanded its nuclear program rapidly. The United States accelerated reactor construction during the late 1970s. Across Europe, nuclear power was increasingly seen not only as an energy source, but as a geopolitical shield against supply disruptions. But nuclear energy was not the only path explored during the crisis. The oil shocks also triggered something less visible, but equally transformative: a surge of government-funded research into renewable energy. Before the 1970s, technologies like solar panels and wind turbines existed largely as experimental projects. They were expensive, inefficient, and rarely considered practical for large-scale power generation. Yet, the geopolitical instability of the oil market forced governments to reconsider these technologies. In the United States, President Jimmy Carter framed energy independence as a national priority. His administration created the U.S. Department of Energy in 1977, consolidating federal energy research and policy under a single institution. Massive funding began flowing into solar research laboratories. Scientists explored new materials for photovoltaic cells, aiming to convert sunlight into electricity more efficiently. Engineers experimented with early wind turbine designs. Geothermal energy projects expanded in regions with volcanic activity. At the time, few of these technologies were economically competitive, but that was not the point. Governments were investing in insurance against future crises. Across the Atlantic, European countries launched similar programs. Denmark, heavily dependent on imported oil during the 1970s, began experimenting with modern wind turbines. Over the following decades, Danish engineers would pioneer technologies that eventually formed the backbone of the global wind energy industry. Japan invested heavily in solar research, driven by its extreme vulnerability to imported energy. In each case, the motivation was not environmental activism, it was geopolitical survival. The oil shocks had revealed a brutal reality. Energy dependence could translate directly into political weakness. If oil producers could disrupt entire economies, then diversification became a matter of national security. Yet, while governments pursued alternative energy sources, they also worked to reshape the structure of global energy markets. One important development was the creation of emergency oil reserves. In 1974, industrial nations established the International Energy Agency. The organization coordinated energy policies among Western economies and required member states to maintain strategic petroleum reserves. These reserves would act as buffers against future supply disruptions. At the same time, governments implemented policies to reduce energy consumption. Fuel efficiency standards for automobiles were introduced in several countries. Public campaigns encouraged conservation. Urban planners began reconsidering transportation systems that depended heavily on private automobiles. The oil crises also reshaped global geopolitics. The sudden wealth flowing into oil-producing nations transformed the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia gained unprecedented financial influence, using oil revenues to reshape regional politics and global investment patterns. Western powers, recognizing their vulnerability, became deeply invested in maintaining stability in energy-producing regions. Energy security gradually became a central pillar of foreign policy. Military alliances, diplomatic negotiations, and economic partnerships increasingly revolved around access to energy resources.
The geopolitical landscape of the late 20th century cannot be understood without recognizing how deeply the oil shocks influenced strategic thinking. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the 1970s crisis was technological. The research programs launched during that decade planted the seeds for innovations that would mature decades later. Early solar panels developed in the 1970s were inefficient and expensive. Yet the material science breakthroughs funded during that period created the foundation for modern photovoltaic technology. Wind turbines built in Denmark during the oil crisis evolved into the massive offshore turbines now generating electricity across Europe and Asia. Energy efficiency technologies, better insulation, improved engines, advanced industrial processes gradually reduced the energy intensity of modern economies. None of these transformations happened quickly. For years after the crisis,